The lobby of the Grand Imperial Hotel in Tokyo was a place where time seemed to stand still, mostly because everything inside it was designed to be perfect. The marble floors were so polished they acted like mirrors, reflecting the golden glow of the crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. The air always smelled faintly of expensive perfume and fresh lilies. It was a quiet, serious kind of wealth. People didn't shout here, they whispered, and the silence was usually filled with the soft clinking of champagne glasses or the distant, respectful sound of luggage wheels rolling across the smooth stone. But for the past few weeks, this perfect silence was being broken every evening at exactly 8 p.m. It wasn't a loud crash or a siren, but something that felt even more out of place in a hotel this fancy. It was the sound of a piano being played very badly. The source of the noise was always the same man. He was Mr. Kenji Sato, a name that carried a lot of weight in Japan. If you read the business newspapers, you knew who he was. He was a billionaire, a man who had built a massive empire buying and selling companies. People said he was ruthless in the boardroom, a shark who didn't care about feelings, only profits. In the city, he was famous, but here in the hotel lobby, he was just a confusing mystery. Every night, the automatic glass doors would slide open, and Mr. Sato would walk in. He didn't look like he was coming from a business meeting anymore. His suit was always impeccable, dark, and tailored perfectly to his thin frame, but his face looked tired. He had gray hair combed neatly back and sharp eyes that usually looked straight ahead, ignoring everyone. He would walk past the front desk, ignoring the polite bows of the receptionists. He would walk right past the expensive bar where the jazz band usually played smooth, boring music that nobody really listened to. Instead, Mr. Sato would head straight for the corner of the lobby. It was a weird spot for a piano, tucked away near a large potted plant that dropped dry leaves on the floor. The instrument there was old. It wasn't the shiny Steinway the hotel used for concerts, it was an upright piano that looked like it had been forgotten. The wood was scratched, and if you looked closely, you could see dust in the cracks. The staff usually tried to keep guests away from it, but Mr. Sato acted like it was the throne of a king. He would pull out the bench, sit down, straighten his jacket, and place his hands on the keys. The entire lobby would hold its breath. The guests sitting on the velvet sofas would put down their drinks. The waiters would pause in their tracks, hoping that tonight would be different. They were all waiting for him to play something beautiful. After all, the man could afford to buy the best concert halls in the country. Surely, he knew how to play then, his fingers would move. The first note always sounded hesitant, like he was testing the waters, then came the second and the third. It was a melody, but not one that anyone recognized. It wasn't classical music like Mozart or Beethoven. It wasn't jazz, and it certainly wasn't pop. To the trained ears of the wealthy guests, it sounded like a mistake. The rhythm was jerky. He would play a few high notes that sounded sharp and sad, then a low chord that seemed to drone on too long. He would play the same sequence of notes over and over again. For 20 minutes, this strange concert would go on. Mr. Sato's face never changed expression. He didn't smile, and he didn't close his eyes in enjoyment. He stared blankly at the sheet music stand, which was completely empty. He looked trapped. The music sounded like a conversation that was going in circles, never finding an ending. It was clumsy and awkward, like watching a grown man try to fit into a child's clothes. The reaction from the lobby was always a mix of confusion and judgment. The hotel manager, a tall man named Mr. Tanaka who took pride in the hotel's image, would watch from behind a pillar with a pained expression. He felt responsible for the comfort of his guests, and this music was making everyone uncomfortable. He had tried everything to stop it or fix it, politely. One evening, Mr. Tanaka had walked over during the performance and whispered, "Mr. Sato, sir. Perhaps tonight, our pianist could accompany you. He knows many wonderful standards." Mr. Sato had stopped playing immediately. He hadn't looked angry, just distant. "No," he said quietly. "I play alone." He didn't explain why. He didn't apologize. He just went back to hitting the same jarring chords. The manager walked away, feeling helpless. The waitstaff, who were usually invisible and efficient, began to dread the 8 p.m. hour. They rolled their eyes at each other behind the guests' backs. They nicknamed him the broken record. "Listen to this," a young waiter whispered to a colleague one night as they polished silverware. "My 5-year-old nephew plays better than that, and he only hits the keys with his fists. How does a man who owns half the city have no rhythm?" "It's an ego thing," the other waiter replied, shaking his head. "He's so rich that nobody tells him he's terrible. He probably thinks he's composing a masterpiece." It's sad, really. The guests were even less kind. An American couple, sitting on the nearest sofa, put their fingers in their ears when Mr. Sato started a particularly loud section. "Is this a joke?" the woman asked her husband, loudly enough for the staff to hear. "We paid thousands of dollars to stay here, and we have to listen to this racket. Can't we complain?" Her husband just shrugged and checked his watch, looking annoyed. "Let's just go to the bar. It's too weird in here." Nobody understood the point of it. In a world where everything had a price tag and a purpose, Mr. Sato's piano playing made no sense. It didn't make money, and it didn't bring pleasure. It was just noise. The staff saw a wealthy, bored man who didn't care that he was bothering people. They saw an eccentric old man who refused to hire a teacher. They looked at his expensive suit and his cold face, and they made assumptions. They thought his music was bad because he didn't know any better, or because he didn't care about the art of music. They were judging the sound, but they weren't hearing the story. On one rainy Tuesday, the lobby was emptier than usual. The sound of the rain tapped against the glass windows, mixing with the strange, echoing notes from the corner piano. Mr. Sato played with a heaviness that seemed to drag his shoulders down. He played a specific series of notes, a sharp climb up the scale, followed by a sudden, crashing drop. It sounded like a cry for help that got lost in translation. Mr. Tanaka, the manager, sighed and looked at the empty tip jar on the piano. It was undignified. But before he could turn away to attend to a checking-in guest, Mr. Sato stopped abruptly. The silence that rushed back into the lobby was heavy. Mr. Sato reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. He didn't look at the piano, and he didn't look at the people. He simply placed the envelope on top of the dusty piano. Then, he stood up, smoothed his suit, and walked toward the elevators. He didn't bow to the staff, and he didn't acknowledge the stairs. He just got into the elevator and disappeared, leaving the sound of the rain and the mystery of the music behind him. Mr. Tanaka walked over to the piano after he was gone, expecting to find a note of complaint or perhaps a check for the hotel. But when he picked up the envelope, he found it thick with cash. It was a tip, a massive one, enough to pay the salary of 3 waiters for a month. The money was real, but the confusion remained. Why pay so much for 20 minutes of terrible music? It was a puzzle that no one in the lobby could solve, and as the staff cleaned the tables and turned off the lamps for the night, they were left with the lingering feeling that they were missing something important, something hidden right in front of their eyes. The days turned into weeks at the Grand Imperial Hotel, and the initial curiosity regarding Mr. Sato's nightly performances began to curdle into something much less pleasant, annoyance. The lobby staff, who were usually the picture of professionalism, found it harder and harder to keep their smiles pasted on. The 8 p.m. hour, which used to be a relaxing time between the dinner rush and the night check-in, had turned into a daily test of patience. The atmosphere in the hotel changed the moment Mr. Sato walked through the doors. It was like a dark cloud entering a room full of sunshine. The problem wasn't just that the music was bad, it was that it was confusing. In a place like the Grand Imperial, everything had a rhythm. The elevators dinged softly on time. The glass doors slid open with a gentle hiss. The staff moved in a coordinated dance, bowing and pouring water without making a sound. They loved order. They loved things that were clean and predictable. But Mr. Sato's piano playing was none of those things. It was messy. It was jagged. It broke the rules of their perfect world. The guests were getting restless, too. The hotel catered to people who were used to getting what they wanted. These were CEOs, politicians, and celebrities. When they sat in the lobby, they expected background music that would make them feel important and relaxed. They expected Mozart or smooth jazz, something that would fade into the background and make their conversations sound smart. Instead, they got a soundtrack that sounded like a struggle. One evening, a well-known art critic from Europe was staying at the hotel. He was sitting in the main lounge with a group of friends, sipping on expensive wine. When Mr. Sato sat down at the piano and began to play his repetitive, sad melody, the critic's face turned red. He couldn't hold his tongue any longer. He waved his hand in the air, trying to catch the attention of the lobby manager. "This is absolutely unbearable," the critic announced, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "I came here for peace, not to listen to a man butcher an instrument. Surely, there is a policy against noise pollution." The manager, whose name was Mr. Tanaka, hurried over. He was sweating slightly. He apologized deeply, bowing several times. "I am so sorry, sir. Mr. Sato is a very special guest. We cannot ask him to stop." "Special guest," the critic scoffed. "He sounds like a child throwing a tantrum. There is no melody. There is no structure. It is just noise. If he is a millionaire, why doesn't he buy a piano that sounds good, or better yet, hire a teacher?" The people at the critics' table laughed. It was a cruel laugh, the kind of laugh people make when they feel superior. They didn't see Mr. Sato as a human being with feelings. They saw him as a bad waiter who had brought the wrong order. They judged him because he wasn't giving them the show they thought they deserved. Mr. Tanaka tried to explain, though he didn't quite understand it himself. It is a personal expression, sir. We must respect his privacy." "Privacy is for his bedroom," the critic shot back. "The lobby is for everyone." This was the invisible wall that stood between Mr. Sato and the rest of the world. To the people in the lobby, the piano was a prop. It was furniture. It was meant to be used for entertainment. But to Mr. Sato, the piano was something entirely different. He wasn't trying to entertain them. He wasn't trying to show off his skill. He was doing something much deeper, something he couldn't put into words. He was trying to remember. Because he couldn't explain this, the gap between them grew wider. The staff began to make bets on how long he would play. Some would joke that he was trying to contact aliens with his strange chords. Others whispered that he had gone crazy after making too much money and was now trying to live as a starving artist. They made fun of his clothes, even though they were expensive. They made fun of his silence. They stripped him of his dignity because they didn't understand his language. The language of music is universal, they say. But that isn't really true. If you don't know the dialect, you might miss the meaning. Mr. Sato wasn't playing in the language of the hotel. He wasn't playing in the language of classical Europe or modern America. He was playing in a language that was much older and much simpler. He was playing in the language of the Japanese countryside. If the guests had closed their eyes and really listened, they might have heard the sound of wind blowing through rice fields. They might have heard the sound of a train whistle in the distance, or the cry of a bird at sunset. But they were too busy listening with their brains and not their hearts. They were counting the beats, checking for technical errors, and waiting for the song to end so they could clap politely and go back to their drinks. Mr. Sato could feel their judgment. He wasn't deaf to the atmosphere. He would pause sometimes, his hands hovering over the keys, and look around the room. His eyes would scan the faces of the staff. He saw the rolled eyes. He saw the impatient tapping of feet. He saw the guests turning away to talk to each other louder to drown out his sound. It must have hurt him deeply, but he never showed it. He would just take a deep breath, straighten his back, and keep playing. He played like a man shouting into a hurricane, hoping that someone, anyone, would hear the message. There was a young bellhop named Hiro who worked the night shift. He was different from the others. He didn't come from a wealthy family, and he hadn't studied music in school. He had grown up in a small fishing village, much like the one Mr. Sato came from. Hiro didn't mock the old man. Instead, he would stand in the shadows by the elevators and listen. One night, after the lobby had cleared out and the critic had gone to bed, Hiro walked over to the piano. Mr. Sato had just finished playing. The silence in the lobby was heavy. Hiro timidly approached with a tray of water. "Sir," Hiro said softly. "Your song, it reminds me of home." Mr. Sato looked up, surprised. He was used to people asking for his autograph or complaining about the noise. No one had ever talked about the song itself. "What home?" Mr. Sato asked, his voice raspy. "The coast, sir," Hiro replied. "It sounds like the waves hitting the rocks in the winter. It sounds lonely, but also peaceful." For a second, a small spark appeared in Mr. Sato's eyes. It wasn't a smile, but it was a look of recognition. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he whispered. "That is it." But then, the floor manager saw Hiro talking to the guest and rushed over. He scolded Hiro for chatting on the job and hurried him away. Mr. Sato was left alone again. The moment of connection was broken. The wall returned. Mr. Sato put his hands back on the keys, but he didn't play. He just sat there for a long time, looking at his reflection in the dark window of the lobby. The pressure on the hotel was mounting. The guests were starting to threaten to leave bad reviews. "Beautiful hotel, but terrible atmosphere," one review read. "Haunted by weird piano music." The general manager was getting desperate. He decided that he couldn't let it go on any longer. He had to do something. He called a meeting with the staff. "We have to make him stop," he said firmly. "Or at least, we have to change what he is doing. Maybe we can get him to take lessons, maybe we can buy him headphones." The staff laughed nervously. They knew Mr. Sato would never agree to that. He was too stubborn. He was a man who was used to getting his own way, and for some reason, his own way involved playing that sad, strange song every single night. The tension in the hotel became like a tight rubber band. Everyone was waiting for it to snap. The guests were angry. The staff was frustrated. And Mr. Sato just kept playing, night after night, unaware that his music was pushing people further and further away. He thought he was reaching out, but in reality, he was building a fortress of sound around himself. The misunderstandings grew deeper. A famous pianist was performing at the hotel theater later that week, and the rumor was that he might stop by the lobby. The staff were terrified. They imagined the famous pianist listening to Mr. Sato and laughing. They imagined the headlines, "Billionaire makes fool of himself in public." They were embarrassed for him, but mostly, they were embarrassed for themselves. They wanted him to be perfect, just like the hotel. They wanted him to fit into the box they had made for him. But Mr. Sato refused to fit. He played the notes that didn't belong. He held the chords too long. He played the melody that didn't go anywhere. He was like a puzzle piece with jagged edges that couldn't fit into the smooth, polished picture of the Grand Imperial Hotel. And until someone understood the picture he was trying to paint, the noise would continue, and the mystery would remain unsolved. The lobby was full of people, but Mr. Sato was the loneliest man in the room. The evening shift at the Grand Imperial Hotel was usually a smooth, well-oiled machine, but on this particular Tuesday, the machine was sputtering. 2 members of the lobby staff had called in sick with the flu, leaving the floor short-handed during the busiest time of the day. The manager was scrambling, moving employees from the back offices to the front of the house to fill the gaps. This is how Emmy found herself standing in the middle of the golden lobby, holding a heavy silver tray, feeling completely out of place. Emmy was a university student with tired eyes and a heavy backpack full of textbooks. She usually worked in the quiet coffee shop on the 2nd floor, where her biggest worry was burning the milk for a latte. She wasn't used to the high-pressure environment of the main lobby. Here, the guests were wealthier, the demands were higher, and the air was much thinner. She felt small in her uniform, conscious of the fact that her shoes were slightly scuffed and her bun was coming loose. Her section for the night included the worst table in the house, the one closest to the old, dusty piano in the corner. The other waitresses had given her sympathetic looks when they assigned her the station. "Good luck," one of them whispered. "It's the torture hour again. You'll have a headache by 8:15. Emmy didn't mind the music as much as the others did. She had heard the complaints in the break room for weeks. The staff called the mystery guest the broken record. They laughed about his lack of skill and made fun of his serious face. But Emmy had never actually seen him play. She had only heard the distant, muffled notes from upstairs. She decided to keep an open mind. Maybe he wasn't as bad as everyone said. At 8 p.m. sharp, the automatic glass doors slid open. Mr. Kenji Sato walked in. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted instantly. The chatter at the bar lowered to a murmur. The staff straightened their postures. Emmy watched him from behind a potted fern. He looked even more imposing in person than he did in the business newspapers. He walked with a rigid back, his eyes focused on nothing in particular. He didn't look like a man enjoying his evening. He looked like a man walking toward a difficult appointment. He walked past Emmy's table without glancing at her. He sat down on the bench of the old piano. He paused for a long time, just staring at the keys. Emmy watched his hands. They were elegant, the hands of an older man who had spent a lifetime working, but they were trembling slightly. He took a deep breath, placed his fingers on the ivory keys, and began to play. Emmy expected the worst. She expected screeching and banging, based on what her co-workers had said. But the sound that came out of the piano wasn't a crash. It was a sigh. The melody was slow and heavy. It wandered up the scale, climbing high into the treble, sounding like a bird trying to fly against a strong wind. Then, it would drop down low, lingering on deep, vibrating bass notes. To the other guests, it probably sounded disjointed. A man sitting at the table next to Emmy's sighed loudly and opened his newspaper, clearly annoyed. But Emmy stood frozen. She wasn't listening to the technical skill. She wasn't counting the beats or checking for wrong notes. She was listening to the feeling of the song. It felt familiar. It tugged at something deep inside her chest, something buried under years of studying and city life. Emmy cleared the empty glasses from the nearby table, moving closer to the piano to hear better. The other waitresses avoided this corner, but she felt pulled toward it. As she wiped the table with a cloth, she really focused on the melody. Mr. Sato played a sequence of 5 notes. Then he hesitated. Then he played them again, but he added a little wobble, a slight slur in the rhythm. It wasn't a mistake. Emmy knew that sound. Her heart skipped a beat. She was from Akita, a rural prefecture in the north of Japan famous for its heavy snow, rough oceans, and old traditions. It was a place where the winters were long and dark, and people huddled together inside wooden houses. When Emmy was a little girl, her grandmother used to sit by the iron stove in the winter, knitting socks and humming songs to pass the time. The songs weren't like the pop music on the radio in Tokyo. They were rougher. They had a specific dialect to them, a way of sliding between notes that sounded like the wind howling through the cracks in the wall. That was exactly what Mr. Sato was doing. The mistakes the staff were laughing about were actually the ornamentations of the Tohoku folk style. He was playing the lullaby Itsuki no Komori Uta, or perhaps a variation of Oiwake. He was playing it with the accent of the countryside, the Zuzyoben dialect, but on the piano keys. The way he lingered on the sad notes wasn't because he forgot where to go next, it was because, in the folk songs of Akita, you hold the pain to let it breathe. Emmy looked around the lobby in shock. She saw the rich foreigners shaking their heads. She saw the staff rolling their eyes. They thought he was a bad player. They thought he was an eccentric millionaire who didn't know music. But he wasn't playing to show off. He was playing to remember. She looked back at Mr. Sato. His eyes were closed now. His head was bowed low over the keys. He wasn't looking at his fingers. He was looking inward. Emmy realized with a start that he wasn't just playing a song, he was searching for something in the melody. Every time he hit a dissonant chord, a note that clashed with the harmony, he looked pained. It was like he was trying to solve a riddle. He was playing the song over and over, hoping the ending would change. The lyrics of the lullaby floated through Emmy's mind, unbidden. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her ears, Yasashi ine. Sleep gently. The song was about a nursemaid caring for someone else's child, missing her own home and family. It was a song of deep loneliness, of being far away from where you belong. Suddenly, Mr. Sato's hand slipped. He hit a jarring, discordant note that rang out loudly through the quiet lobby. He stopped abruptly, pulling his hands back as if he had been burned. The silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. Mr. Sato let out a long, shaky breath. He stared at his hands. He looked frustrated. He looked defeated. He shook his head slightly, murmuring something to himself that Emmy couldn't hear. It looked like he was giving up. He sat there, paralyzed, the unfinished song hanging in the air like a ghost. Emmy felt a strong urge to walk over to him. She wanted to tell him that she heard it. She wanted to tell him that she understood. She wanted to tell him that the song wasn't wrong, it was just lonely. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Protocol said she should stay invisible. The manager would be furious if she bothered a VIP guest. But the music was louder than the rules. This wasn't just a customer. This was a person from her home, suffering in a fancy hotel lobby, surrounded by people who didn't speak his language. The guests at the nearby table were annoyed by the silence now, waiting for the waiter to bring their water. They waved their hands at Emmy, signaling for service. She saw them, but for a moment, she didn't move. She was glued to the spot, watching Mr. Sato's slumped shoulders. He looked so small sitting there. Emmy made a decision. She ignored the waving guests for a second longer. She adjusted her tray and took a small step forward, away from the safety of the serving station and toward the dusty corner piano. She didn't know what she was going to say or do. She wasn't a musician. She was just a waitress from a farm town. But she knew the song. And sometimes, that is enough to bridge the widest gap. The lobby buzzed with its usual indifference, but a quiet connection was forming in the corner, waiting for the courage to speak. Mr. Sato didn't know it yet, but his long winter of silence was about to end. The air in the lobby seemed to freeze the moment the jarring note escaped the piano. It was a sharp, ugly sound that clashed violently with the soft jazz usually drifting from the ceiling speakers. To the wealthy guests sipping their espresso, it was just another mistake in a long line of errors made by the eccentric old man. They sighed, checked their expensive watches, and wished the waiter would hurry up with the bill. But to Kenji, that broken note was a failure. It felt like a door slamming shut in his face. He pulled his hands away from the keys and held them in mid-air, his fingers trembling. He stared at the dusty wood of the piano, his breathing heavy and ragged. He felt a lump forming in his throat, a tightness that had been there for months but seemed to get worse every time he tried to play this specific song. He was so close. He could hear the melody in his head the way it was supposed to sound, the way it sounded when the wind blew through the rice fields of his childhood. But his fingers wouldn't obey. They were stiff and old, ruined by years of signing contracts and holding pens instead of practicing scales. Kenji felt a wave of wash over him. He was a man who controlled empires. He could fire 1,000 people with a single signature. He could buy buildings and sell companies. But here, in front of this cheap, dusty piano, he was powerless. He couldn't force the music to come out. He couldn't force the memories to stay. He sat there, slumped over the keys, looking more like a lost child than a billionaire. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. The guests began to whisper. The staff looked away, embarrassed by his lack of composure. Emmy watched him from her spot near the pillar. She saw the way his shoulders shook, just slightly. It wasn't the shake of anger, it was the shake of exhaustion. She recognized that look. She had seen it on her father's face the night the family farm in Akita was foreclosed. It was the look of someone carrying a weight that was too heavy for one person. Her heart ached for him. The other waitresses thought he was just a bad player who didn't know when to quit. But Emmy knew he was fighting a battle. The floor manager, Mr. Tanaka, was walking toward the piano with a concerned look. Emmy knew he was going to ask Kenji to leave or offer him a glass of water to make him stop. She knew that if the manager interrupted, Kenji would close up completely. He would stand up, put his mask back on, and the moment would be lost forever. The song would remain unfinished, and the old man would remain lonely. Emmy's feet moved before her brain could give them permission. She didn't think about the rules. She didn't think about the fact that she was just a student and he was one of the most powerful men in the country. She didn't think about getting fired. She only thought about the song. She stepped out from the shadows, leaving her tray on a side table. The carpet cushioned her footsteps, making her approach silent. The guests at the nearby table didn't even notice her. They were too busy complaining about the noise. She walked past the manager, dodging him just as he was about to speak to Kenji. She reached the side of the piano, standing just a few feet away from the bench. Up close, Kenji looked even older. His skin was pale, and his eyes were rimmed with red. He was staring blindly at the wall, lost in a world of pain. Emmy took a deep breath. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it. She felt small and terrified, but the memory of her grandmother's voice gave her courage. She didn't say hello. She didn't apologize for interrupting. She simply opened her mouth and let the song out. Her voice was soft, not loud enough to carry to the back of the lobby, but clear and true right next to the piano. She sang the line that Kenji had failed to play. Yasashi ine, Yoruji Akita. The words were in the heavy, rolling dialect of Akita. To the average person in Tokyo, it might have sounded rough or uneducated. But to Kenji, it was the sound of home. It was the sound of the snow melting in the spring. It was the sound of his mother's voice. Emmy didn't sing it like a performance. She sang it like a lullaby, gentle and slow. Kenji's reaction was immediate. His body went rigid, as if an electric current had passed through him. He didn't turn his head at first. He just sat there, frozen. Perhaps he thought he was imagining it. Perhaps he thought his mind had finally snapped and he was hearing ghosts. Emmy didn't stop. She sang the next line, her voice trembling slightly, harmonizing perfectly with the memory in his head. Sara no Hoshi wa, Mata Itaru. The manager stopped in his tracks, his mouth open. He was shocked to see a waitress singing to a guest. It broke every rule in the hotel handbook. But before he could step in to scold her, he saw Kenji's face. The billionaire slowly turned his head. His eyes, which had been dull and lifeless just seconds ago, were wide open. They were filled with tears that threatened to spill over. He looked at Emmy, really looked at her, as if seeing a human being for the first time that night. He wasn't looking at her uniform. He wasn't looking at her name tag. He was looking at her soul. You. Kenji whispered. His voice was cracked and dry. You know this song? Emmy nodded, her face flushing red. She felt shy now, the reality of what she had done crashing down on her. Yes, sir. My grandmother, she sang it to me. In Akita. Akita, Kenji repeated the word as if it were a magic spell. He glanced around the lobby, at the fancy lights and the modern furniture, and then back at Emmy. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel alone. The language barrier he had been feeling wasn't about Japanese or English. It was about the language of the heart. He had been speaking in the dialect of his home, a dialect of sadness and nostalgia, and for weeks, no one had understood. They had only heard noise. But this girl, this young waitress with the scuffed shoes, understood. It is difficult to play, Kenji said softly, his eyes dropping back to the keys. I cannot finish it. The rhythm is different, Emmy said gently, stepping a little closer. It is not like city music. It walks slowly. Like walking in deep snow. Kenji let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. Yes. Deep snow. The guests at the nearby table had stopped their conversation now. They were watching the scene with curiosity. The annoyance was gone, replaced by intrigue. They saw the powerful old man and the young waitress, connected by something they couldn't see but could feel. The hostility in the air evaporated. The manager signaled for the other staff to stay back and give them space. Kenji placed his hands back on the keys. They were still shaking, but less now. He looked at Emmy, waiting for a signal. "Sing with me," he asked. It wasn't an order, it was a request. It was the most human thing he had said in a long time. Emmy nodded again. She took a small breath and began to hum the melody, giving him the tempo she remembered from her childhood. Kenji listened to her hum. He adjusted his timing. He let go of the rigid, classical technique he had been trying to force on the song. He let his fingers relax. He pressed down on the keys, and this time, the notes didn't clash. They flowed. Emmy began to sing the lyrics again, her voice weaving in and out of the piano melody. The song wasn't perfect. It was still sad, and the piano was still old and tinny. But it was real. It was a bridge between two people from the same distant world, stranded together in a city of strangers. As they reached the part where he usually stopped, Emmy's voice lifted, carrying the melody over the hurdle. Kenji followed her. He played the final resolving chord. It rang out through the lobby, clear and strong. The song was finished. The night was no longer unfinished. Kenji held the final chord, letting the vibration die out naturally. He looked at Emmy, and a single tear finally rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just smiled at her, a small, fragile smile that transformed his entire face. "Thank you," he whispered. "You found the note I was looking for." In that moment, the fancy lobby, the judgmental guests, and the strict rules of the hotel didn't matter. The language of the music had finally been translated. The millionaire was no longer a mystery, and the waitress was no longer invisible. They were just two people, far from home, sharing a song. The sound of the final chord seemed to hang in the air of the lobby like a held breath. It didn't fade away quickly like the other notes, it lingered, vibrating against the high ceiling and the marble floors. It was a deep, rich sound that felt like a door closing gently on a windy day. For the first time in weeks, the strange, jagged noise that had plagued the Grand Imperial Hotel was gone. In its place was a heavy, beautiful silence. The guests who had been rolling their eyes and checking their watches just moments ago were now perfectly still. The businessman with the newspaper lowered his paper. The couple by the window stopped talking. Even the hotel staff, who usually moved like invisible ghosts in the background, stood frozen in their tracks. They all felt it. Something had changed. They didn't hear a man playing a piano anymore, they had just witnessed two people sharing a secret. The annoyance vanished, replaced by a quiet sense of respect. Kenji sat on the bench, his hands resting on his knees, staring down at the keys. The tears that had gathered in his eyes didn't fall, but the hardness around his mouth had softened completely. He looked like a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. He took a deep, shaky breath, the kind of breath you take after swimming underwater for a long time. He didn't immediately stand up. He didn't rush to leave. He just sat there, letting the peace wash over him. Emmy stood a few feet away, her hands clasped together in front of her apron. Her face was flushed red, and she felt a bit lightheaded. She couldn't believe she had just sung in the middle of the lobby. She was terrified that she had broken a rule and would be scolded. But looking at Kenji, she knew she had done the right thing. Slowly, Kenji turned to look at her. His gaze wasn't sharp or distant like it was when he looked at the other guests. It was warm. It was the look a grandfather gives to a grandchild who has brought him a drawing. "You have a voice from the past," Kenji said softly. His voice was kind now, not raspy or strained. "I have not heard those words spoken in that dialect since I was a small boy." Emmy gave a small bow. "My grandmother taught me, sir. We are from the same place." Kenji nodded slowly. "I know. I could hear it. That is why I could not play the song." He looked back at the piano keys, his fingers tracing the ivory. "For many years, I have tried to run away from that part of my life. I built my companies in Tokyo, I wear suits from Italy, and I speak English. I thought if I became modern enough, the past would leave me alone. But the song, it stayed in my head." He paused, looking up at the crystal chandelier as if seeing something else entirely. "My wife, she was from Akita, too. When she was sick, in the hospital, the only thing that calmed her down was this lullaby. I tried to play it for her in her last days. But I didn't know how. I only knew the business notes, the numbers. I didn't know the heart notes. The lobby was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the drinks at the bar. The staff was listening now, realizing for the first time that the bad music wasn't a game. It was a man trying to say goodbye to the person he loved. I made a promise," Kenji continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I promised her I would learn to play it perfectly. I thought if I played it loud enough, she would hear me. But every night I sat here, the song felt wrong. The rhythm was too stiff. It sounded like the city traffic, not the wind in the rice fields. I was angry at myself. I thought I had forgotten the music." He looked at Emmy with a look of pure gratitude. "But I didn't forget the music. I just forgot the language. You reminded me. The song isn't about the notes on the page. It is about the way you slide off the tone, the way you breathe between the phrases. You sang it the way she would have sung it." Emmy felt tears cling her own eyes. "She would be happy that you finished it, sir." "Yes," Kenji whispered. "I think she is listening now." The realization hit the hotel manager, Mr. Tanaka, who was standing near the front desk. He looked at the old piano in the corner, which he had viewed as a nuisance for so long. He realized that the dust and the scratches weren't signs of neglect, they were signs of use, of emotion. The music was never meant for the guests. It was a prayer. Kenji took a handkerchief out of his pocket and wiped his face. He stood up from the bench, his movements slow but steady. He buttoned his jacket and smoothed his tie, transforming back into the powerful billionaire, but his eyes were different. They were softer now. The darkness was gone. He turned to Emmy. He didn't offer her money. He didn't try to buy her silence or her time. Instead, he stepped closer and bowed to her. It wasn't a small nod. It was a deep, respectful bow, the kind you give to a teacher or an elder. He held it for a long time. "Thank you," he said, standing up straight. "You did not just serve a drink tonight. You helped a soul find peace." Emmy bowed back, deeply. "You are welcome, sir." Kenji looked around the lobby. The other guests were watching him with reverence now. The whispers had stopped completely. No one was laughing. No one was rolling their eyes. They were all witnesses to a moment of pure humanity. Kenji walked toward the elevators. He didn't leave the massive tip on the piano that he usually did. He didn't need to pay for the space anymore. He had received something worth much more than money. He walked into the elevator, and as the doors closed, he didn't look back at the piano. He didn't need to play it again. The song was finished. The lobby stayed quiet for a long time after he left. The atmosphere had changed completely. It felt warmer, more real. The next evening, 8 p.m. came and went. The piano in the corner sat empty. The guests looked over, half expecting the strange old man to return, but he didn't. He never came back to the Grand Imperial Hotel to play. The staff later heard that he had retired and moved back to the countryside, perhaps to the place where the lullaby was born. But the story of that night stayed in the hotel. The staff stopped judging the guests so quickly. The manager decided to keep the old piano in the corner, tuning it up and polishing it, instead of hiding it away. They didn't see it as a dusty piece of furniture anymore. They saw it as a place where a broken heart had been mended. And she went back to her classes and her shifts at the coffee shop. She was still just a waitress trying to get by. But sometimes, when the hotel lobby was quiet, she would look at that empty corner and smile. She realized that you don't have to be rich or powerful to change someone's life. You just have to listen. You just have to speak the language of the heart. The bad music was gone, but the beautiful memory of that song remained, playing softly in the minds of everyone who was lucky enough to hear the final note.